What happens when the past arrives in a form no one is prepared to accept? Tama, history likes clean lines. It prefers orderly maps, tidy dates, and a procession of certainty moving from one century to the next. But every so often, something rises from the ground that does not fit the story. A carved stone on a barren hillside, a small figure pulled from impossible depths, a metal object resting beside ancient bones. And in that moment, the question is no longer only what was found. The deeper question is who gets to decide what a discovery is allowed to mean. Across deserts, caves, museums, and forgotten excavation sites, there are objects that seem to stand just outside the official frame. Some were dismissed, some were locked away, some were studied in whispers and then placed beyond reach. Their discoverers often followed the same path. First wonder, then resistance, then silence. Not always because they were right, and not always because they were wrong, but because uncertainty can be harder for institutions to tolerate than error. This is not a story about proving every mystery true. It is a story about the fragile space between evidence and belief, about the tension between curiosity and control, about the human need to build narratives strong enough to live by, and the equal human need to question them when the ground beneath our feet begins to shift. The artifacts in this journey come wrapped in doubt, controversy, and longing. Some may eventually be explained by ordinary means. Others may remain unresolved. But together they reveal something larger than any single object. They show us how history is not only discovered, it is interpreted, defended, and sometimes protected from the very people who seek it. And so we begin here, in that uneasy space between the known and the nearly forgotten, where the silence around an object can speak as loudly as the object itself. It began with a hillside, a sheet of hard light, and a silence so complete that even the wind seemed careful. In New Mexico in the 1930s, a professor named Frank Hibben came upon a massive boulder marked with lines that did not belong to the landscape around it. The carving was not casual graffiti, not the rough trace of a passing hand. It carried the weight of intention. Across the stone ran an inscription resembling an ancient form of Hebrew, a text that echoed one of the oldest moral inheritances in human memory, the Ten Commandments. If the stone was genuine, its meaning stretched far beyond language. It would suggest that travelers from the ancient Mediterranean, or people shaped by that world, had reached North America long before the dates preserved in conventional history. Not as rumor, not as legend, as presence carved in rock. Hibben did what scholars are meant to do. He documented the site. He photographed it. He shared what he had found. But discovery does not always bring welcome. Sometimes it brings distance. Papers stalled, the interest turned cold. Quiet warnings replaced open debate. The stone remained in place, but the conversation around it seemed to narrow, as though the real danger was not the object itself, but the questions it invited. Years passed, the inscription weathered. Opinions hardened before evidence could be fully explored. Some saw an authentic trace of a forgotten crossing. Others saw misreading, imitation, or wishful thinking pressed into stone. The truth remained unsettled, suspended between scholarship and suspicion. And that may be the most revealing part of the story. Not whether the boulder can solve history on its own, but how quickly uncertainty becomes uncomfortable when it touches the foundations of what we think we know. A stone can sit in open air for generations, visible to anyone willing to climb toward it. Yet even in plain sight, the past can remain out of reach, not because it is hidden, but because we have not agreed on how to see it. Picture a field after rain, the soil dark and soft, the earth giving up its secrets by degrees. In 1904, near Acámbaro in central Mexico, a German-born merchant named Waldemar Julsrud noticed fragments of clay emerging from the ground. What began as curiosity became obsession. Over time, thousands of figurines were recovered from the site, an enormous collection shaped by many hands in many centuries, if the evidence was to be believed. At first glance, some of the objects seemed familiar enough. Human figures, scenes of daily life, animals. But then came the forms that unsettled everything around them. Large reptilian bodies, long necks, heavy tails, creatures with horns, plates, and jaws that resembled what modern people would call dinosaurs. Not vague monsters from folklore, but images that appeared strangely specific, as though memory and imagination had merged in fired clay. The collection drew attention, then doubt. The choice before scholars was stark. Either the figurines were elaborate modern fabrications, or they hinted at a relationship between human storytelling and deep prehistory far more complicated than accepted narratives allowed. Tests seemed, at moments, to push the mystery further rather than resolve it. Some examinations suggested great age. The scale of the collection made fraud feel difficult to explain cleanly. Yet the more provocative the implications became, the less welcome the objects seemed in formal institutions. Pieces were taken for study and not returned. Others were dismissed before being fully examined. The collection survived, but in fragments, scattered between storage, private hands, and the uneasy borderland between curiosity and embarrassment. What remained was not a conclusion, but a wound in the record. Perhaps that is why the figurines still linger in the imagination. Not because they prove a lost world beyond dispute, but because they remind us how fragile certainty can be. When an object does not fit the map, do we redraw the map, or do we place the object in a drawer and wait for the questions to grow quiet? Sometimes the most unsettling discoveries are the smallest ones. In the early 20th century, in the winding darkness of a cave system near the Grand Canyon, explorer G.E. Kincaid reportedly entered a chamber unlike anything he expected to find in the American Southwest. Deep inside the stone, beyond narrow passages and hidden openings, were signs of deliberate construction. Rooms cut into rock, objects placed with purpose, and traces of a culture that seemed to point far beyond the local world. Accounts described tablets, copper implements, ceremonial objects, and perhaps most striking of all, artifacts bearing forms that resembled Egyptian design. Statues, symbols, echoes of a civilization associated not with Arizona, but with the Nile. If those reports were accurate, then the cave was not simply an archaeological site. It was a breach in the wall of accepted geography, a suggestion that the ancient world may have traveled farther and connected more deeply than history had been willing to admit. And then the site seemed to vanish into rumor. Access became impossible. Officials denied knowledge or declined to discuss it. Researchers searched for the location and found only cliffs, shadow, and silence. The story endured in newspaper archives and whispered retellings, always hovering between revelation and mirage. Was it an exaggerated report, a misunderstood expedition, a buried truth, or some blend of all three? The evidence remained frustratingly out of reach, as though the canyon had taken the story back into itself. What gives the tale its staying power is not only the possibility of what was found, but the strange afterlife of the finding. An artifact can be examined. A vanished site becomes something else entirely. It enters that deeper chamber of the human mind where mystery is stored alongside memory, where doubt does not erase wonder but sharpens it. The Grand Canyon is already a monument to time, each layer of rock holding ages almost too vast to understand. Perhaps that is why this story persists there so naturally. In a place built by depth, even uncertainty feels ancient. And sometimes the things we cannot verify still tell us something important about our hunger to connect distant worlds, and about how quickly knowledge can disappear once it slips beyond the edge of our reach. Imagine a shelf in a museum basement, the air cool and still, where an object sits without context, as if it arrived from a story no one finished. In the late 19th century, a curious artifact emerged from the ground in Idaho, a small clay figurine shaped with a confidence that made it difficult to dismiss as a random oddity. It was delicately formed, unmistakably human in outline, and soon became known as the Nampa figurine. What made it extraordinary was not only its craftsmanship, but the depth from which it was said to have been recovered, far below the surface, in layers of earth believed to be immensely old. If that depth was reported correctly, the implications were profound. The figurine would suggest human artistry, or at least human-like workmanship, in a time period long before orthodox timelines allowed. It was an object that did not merely raise questions about migration or contact. It reached into the far deeper issue of when complex human presence could be placed in North America at all. Predictably, the resistance came quickly. Skeptics argued contamination, accident, misidentification, or even hoax. Could the object have fallen into the borehole from the surface? Could the excavation records have been mistaken? In archaeology, context is everything, and once context is doubted, the artifact begins to drift. It becomes less a discovery than a problem to be managed. Yet the figurine itself remains stubbornly evocative. Small enough to fit in a hand, old enough, perhaps, to trouble an entire chronology, it carried the peculiar power of humble things. Great monuments can overwhelm us with scale, but a tiny human form speaks more intimately. It suggests touch, attention, a maker looking at the world and choosing to leave behind not a tool, but an image. And perhaps that is why the Nampa figurine still unsettles the imagination. It reminds us that history does not always announce itself with grandeur. Sometimes it appears as something almost fragile, easily misplaced, easily dismissed. A quiet object, a difficult question, a suggestion that beneath our confident timelines, other stories may still be waiting in the dark, asking not to be believed too quickly, but not to be forgotten either. What if the most troubling object is not a monument or a manuscript, but a piece of metal no larger than a tool left behind in the wrong century? In 1974, along the Mureș River in Romania, workers digging through layers of sand uncovered three buried objects. Two appeared ancient and familiar enough: bones from a mastodon, remnants of a vanished animal world. The third was something else entirely. It was a wedge-shaped metal piece, angular and machined, with the unmistakable look of manufacture rather than accident. Its composition made the mystery deeper. Tests suggested a high proportion of aluminum, a metal associated with modern industrial processes, not deep antiquity. Aluminum is abundant in the earth but difficult to isolate. It requires knowledge, energy, and technique. To find an object of that kind in sediment associated with prehistoric remains was to encounter not just an anomaly, but a contradiction. Scientists who examined the piece could not easily explain it away. The shape seemed purposeful. The surface carried the quiet chemistry of age. The surrounding layers were described as undisturbed, as though the object had rested there far longer than conventional history would allow. For a brief moment, the artifact entered public discussion. It was displayed, noted, debated. And then, as so often happens in stories like this, it receded behind institutional walls. Access narrowed, explanations multiplied without fully settling the matter. Some proposed that it was part of modern machinery, misplaced and misread. Others wondered whether it pointed to a forgotten technology or to something stranger still. None of these interpretations has closed the case. The object remains suspended between categories, too unusual to fit neatly, too tangible to ignore. There is something almost poetic about that. Metal is often treated as the mark of progress, of human mastery over matter. Yet here was a metal object that seemed to resist mastery of another kind, the mastery of narrative. It would not stay where history wanted it to stay. And perhaps that is why it still lingers in the imagination. Because every civilization depends on chronology, on the comfort of sequence. First this, then that. But when an object appears out of order, it does more than puzzle experts. It reminds us that knowledge is not a straight corridor. It is a landscape full of breaks, buried turns, in rooms we have not opened yet. Begin with a footprint, not a statue, not a tablet, not a temple wall, just the impression of a living thing pressed into ancient stone, as fleeting and ordinary as a step across wet ground. In the Paluxy riverbed of Texas, where drought and shifting waters sometimes expose long, hidden tracks, researchers and curious observers found something that seemed to disturb the boundary between human history and geological time. Among the impressions attributed to dinosaurs were marks that some believed looked strikingly human: elongated footprints, heel to toe, appearing in rock layers thought to belong to an unimaginably distant age. If those shapes were truly human, the implications would be staggering. It would mean not simply a revision of timelines, but a collapse of assumptions so basic that the entire architecture of prehistory would have to be reconsidered. Yet footprints are deceptive things. Erosion can lengthen a shape. Mineral patterns can mislead the eye. A partial track can become, under hope or fear, something more complete than it is. That ambiguity shaped everything that followed. Some investigators argued that the impressions were natural distortions of dinosaur tracks, altered by pressure, water, and time. Others remain convinced that at least a few showed proportions too suggestive to dismiss. The river kept changing, revealing and concealing the evidence with each season, as though nature itself refused to let the case rest in certainty. Objects can be collected, bones can be stored, but tracks belong to the landscape. They are evidence that cannot be easily moved without losing something essential. And perhaps that is why the Paluxy mystery has endured. It is not fixed in a museum case. It lives in mud, stone, argument, memory. It asks us to consider how fragile interpretation can be when time has worn away the edges. A footprint that is one of the most intimate traces a being can leave behind. It records no speech, no ambition, no explanation, only presence. Someone or something was here. And when the past offers us only that, the simplest message can become the hardest to understand. We do not just read tracks in stone. We read ourselves into them, and in doing so reveal how much of history is also a story about the limits of our own seeing. Consider a wall of rock split open by age and weather, and inside it, a shape that should not be there. In the late 19th century, reports emerged from Illinois of a chain made of gold discovered within a lump of coal. The story was simple, almost too simple. A woman breaking apart coal for her household fire found a delicate metal chain embedded inside, its links partly exposed, as though the stone had grown around it. Coal, of course, belongs to a world unimaginably older than human craft. If the account was accurate, then the chain did not merely challenge a date or a migration theory. It unsettled the very sequence by which human history is arranged. Skeptics responded with understandable caution. Could the chain have slipped into a crack in the coal after extraction? Could memory have refined the event into something more remarkable than it was? Without the object preserved under rigorous conditions, certainty was always going to remain elusive. And yet the image endured, human workmanship resting inside a material formed across immense expanses of prehistoric time. That endurance tells us something. We are drawn to stories like this not only because they suggest hidden chapters in the past, but because they force an encounter between two different scales of existence. There is the human scale, measured in lifetimes, hands, and habits. Then there is geological time, slow beyond comprehension, where forests become seams of black stone and entire worlds vanish without witness. To imagine a crafted object caught inside that depth is to feel those two scales collide. Whether the chain was an anomaly of perception, a misreported accident, or something harder to explain, it has survived as a question disguised as a household object. Jewelry is intimate. It belongs near the body. It carries the warmth of touch. To find such a thing bound to coal is to feel history become strangely personal, as though the deep earth itself were returning a relic without explanation. And maybe that is why the story still resonates. Not because it offers proof, but because it captures a human instinct older than archaeology itself. The sense that beneath ordinary life, inside the very materials we use and break apart without thinking, there may be traces of a time that does not fit our categories. A chain, after all, is made of links, one connected to the next. So is history. And sometimes one missing link is enough to make the whole structure tremble. A hammer is one of the simplest objects we know. Weight, grip, force. It belongs to labor, to building, to the ordinary intelligence of the hand, which is precisely why one found in Texas became so difficult to forget. In the 1930s, near London, Texas, a couple reportedly noticed a piece of wood protruding from a rock formation. When the stone was opened, it revealed what appeared to be an iron hammer, its handle partly mineralized, its metal head enclosed in material said to be extremely old. At first glance, the object looked unremarkable, almost humble, but its setting transformed it into something else entirely. If the surrounding rock truly formed over vast geological ages, then the hammer posed an impossible question. How could a manufactured tool appear inside stone associated with a timeline far older than recorded civilization? The paradox was immediate and irresistible. Here was not an ornate relic or symbolic figurine open to wide interpretation, but a practical instrument. Not mythic, not ceremonial, a tool made for use. As with so many anomalies, explanation divided along familiar lines. Some argued that mineral accretion had hardened around a comparatively recent object, creating the illusion of great age. Others pointed to the tool's construction and corrosion patterns as evidence that it deserved more serious study. The object passed through private hands, public fascination, and skeptical dismissal, never fully settling into either certainty or irrelevance. What gives the story its lasting power is the nature of the object itself. A hammer is intimate evidence of intention. It implies a maker, a task, a moment of effort. Someone held it, someone swung it, someone trusted it to shape the physical world. When such a thing appears outside the sequence we expect, the disruption feels strangely personal, as if the past has not only broken its own rules, but reached forward into our daily lives. Perhaps that is the deeper reason these stories endure. They do not merely challenge chronology. They disturb our sense of continuity. We like to imagine history as a staircase, each step laid down in order. But a misplaced tool suggests another image, a workshop after the lights have gone out, full of unfinished things and unknown hands. And in that dimness, one ordinary hammer can sound louder than any monument because it speaks in the plain language of human work and asks how much of that work has been lost to time. Sometimes a cave is more than a shelter. Sometimes it becomes a vault where memory waits in the dark, preserved by dust, silence, and the patience of stone. In 1911, miners digging through deposits in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, began turning up human remains and woven objects unlike anything they expected. At first, the finds might have seemed like ordinary archaeology emerging from an extraordinary environment, but as more material came to light, the story grew stranger. Some of the bones appeared unusually large. Sandals seemed made for feet bigger than average. There were weapons, tools, and intricately woven duck decoys so skillfully made that even modern observers would later admire their precision. Then came the detail that gave the story its haunting afterlife. Reports of preserved hair, with a reddish color, clinging to skulls found in the cave's dry interior. For local Paiute communities, the cave did not exist in silence. It lived inside oral tradition. Stories spoke of a people remembered as red-haired giants, beings associated with conflict, distance, and an older layer of the land's memory. Oral histories are often treated as symbolic, and perhaps they are. But when physical discoveries seem to echo inherited stories, the boundary between legend and evidence becomes harder to keep neatly separated. The remains and associated objects were dispersed. Some went to museums and institutions. Some were cataloged imperfectly. Some seem to have vanished into that familiar zone of restricted access, misidentification, or simple neglect. What survived in clearer view were the crafted objects, especially the decoys, which testified to remarkable skill. What faded from the record were the bones that made the larger questions so difficult to ignore. And maybe that is what makes Lovelock Cave so resonant. It is not simply a story about whether every report was accurate in detail. It is a story about what happens when material evidence and inherited memory briefly illuminate each other. A cave can preserve more than artifacts. It can preserve a tension between worlds, science and story, measurement and meaning, proof and remembrance. In the end, the deepest mystery may not be who lived there, but why some traces were elevated as heritage while others slipped into obscurity. We keep the objects that fit our systems. The rest linger at the edges, where history becomes less certain and more human. What if an ancient jar was not meant only to hold something, but to make something happen? In 1938, while examining objects in the Iraq Museum, German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig noticed a group of modest clay vessels that seemed, at first, almost forgettable. They were small, sealed containers from the Parthian world, each holding a copper cylinder and an iron rod arranged in a way that felt strangely familiar. To anyone shaped by the modern age of wires and current, the design suggested a startling possibility. These vessels may once have functioned as simple batteries. It was a quiet idea with enormous consequences. If the jars were intentionally designed to produce an electrical charge, then ancient craftsmen may have understood a practical form of electrochemistry nearly 2,000 years before such knowledge entered the accepted story of modern science. Perhaps they were used for electroplating, laying a fine coat of precious metal over another surface. Perhaps they served some ritual or experimental purpose we no longer understand. Either way, the objects hinted that technical imagination in the ancient world may have run deeper than our categories allow. Experiments only sharpened the question. Replicas of the jars filled with acidic liquids like vinegar or grape juice produced measurable current. The arrangement worked. And yet proof of intention remained elusive. That narrow gap between possibility and certainty became the whole argument. Scholars who resisted the battery interpretation preferred safer explanations. Storage vessel, sacred container, object of unknown use. The jars were acknowledged, but the more disruptive reading was kept at arm's length. Then history itself intervened. War scattered museum collections, erased records, and broke the chain of custody that careful scholarship depends on. Some of the original objects disappeared into looting, evacuation, or destruction. Others survived, but not in a way that resolved the question. And so the jars remained suspended between worlds. Ancient and strangely modern, ordinary in appearance, profound in implication. They remind us that human knowledge is not always a steady ascent. Sometimes it flickers. Sometimes it is discovered, forgotten, and discovered again. And sometimes all that remains is a vessel, a trace of possibility, and the unsettling thought that the past may have known more than it could preserve. Begin with the sea, because the sea is where certainty goes to loosen. In 1900, sponge divers sheltering from a storm off the Greek island of Antikythera descended into deep water and found the broken remains of a shipwreck. From the seabed came statues, pottery, glassware, and the ordinary luxury of an ancient voyage interrupted by disaster. Then, among the corroded fragments, there emerged something that did not resemble treasure at all. It looked like a lump of bronze ruined by time. Only later did anyone understand that inside the corrosion were gears. As conservators and scholars studied the object, a startling picture emerged. The device was mechanical, intricate, and precise. It contained an arrangement of interlocking gear wheels capable of modeling celestial cycles, the movements of the sun, the moon, eclipses, and perhaps even the known planets. It was, in effect, an ancient analog computer built more than 2,000 years ago with a sophistication no one expected from its era. That discovery changed the story of technology, but not all at once. At first, the mechanism was too advanced for the assumptions surrounding it. Some doubted the dating, others treated it as an isolated marvel, a brilliant accident without larger implications. But the more the fragments were imaged and reconstructed, the harder it became to deny what they represented. The ancient Mediterranean had produced not only philosophy, sculpture, and mathematics, but machinery of extraordinary conceptual depth. And yet even now, the Antikythera mechanism carries a strange melancholy. For all its brilliance, it survives only in pieces. We do not know exactly who made it, how many devices like it once existed, or how much knowledge disappeared with the workshops that shaped it. What we have is enough to inspire awe, and not enough to close the ache. Perhaps that is why the mechanism feels so modern in spirit. It reminds us that progress is not guaranteed, and that genius does not always leave a clear line forward. Civilizations can imagine wonders, then lose them. Knowledge can flourish, then sink. And sometimes the future of an idea waits at the bottom of the sea, rusted almost beyond recognition, until someone looking for one thing finds another. And the past begins quietly revising our sense of what human beings have always been capable of. By now, the pattern has become familiar. An object appears, the ground opens, a scholar, worker, diver, or wanderer looks down and sees something that should not be there. Then comes the second discovery, often more revealing than the first. Not the artifact itself, but the reaction it provokes. Across continents and centuries, the details change. A carved inscription on a sun-struck rock. Clay figures that seem to remember creatures from another age. A cave whose reported contents suggest worlds once thought separate. A figurine from impossible depths. A shaped metal piece beside ancient bones. Tracks in stone, tools in rock. A chain in coal. A jar that may once have carried a current. A machine recovered from the floor of the sea. Taken together, these stories do not form a single theory. They form something quieter, and in many ways more important, a portrait of human uncertainty. Some of these objects may one day be explained by error, contamination, embellishment, or misunderstanding. That possibility matters. Mature curiosity is not gullibility. It is the willingness to look steadily at the evidence without forcing it to become either miracle or fraud before the work is done. But there is another possibility we must also leave room for, that parts of the past are more complicated, more discontinuous, and more imaginative than our inherited maps have allowed. What institutions protect is not only truth, but coherence. Museums, universities, archives, and governments are built to preserve knowledge. Yet they are also shaped by the need for stable narratives. That does not make them villains. It makes them human. The same species that searches for understanding also fears disorder. We want discovery, but only up to the point where it threatens the frame through which we organize meaning. So perhaps the real lesson of these confiscated, disputed, or half-forgotten artifacts is not that history is hiding a grand secret waiting to be dramatically unveiled. It is that truth is often slower, quieter, and more fragile than that. It survives in fragments. It is carried by stubborn questions, and sometimes it asks us for something harder than belief or disbelief. It asks for patience, the patience to admit that the past may still be speaking in a language we have only begun to hear. In the end, these stories are not only about artifacts, they are about us. They ask what kind of species buries meaning in the ground and then spends generations trying to recover it. They ask why some discoveries are welcomed into textbooks while others remain in margins, private collections, museum vaults, or the uncertain territory of rumor. Most of all, they ask whether history is a finished account or a living conversation between what survives and what we are willing to see. There is a temptation, when confronted with disputed objects, to choose a side too quickly, to declare them either final proof or final nonsense. But the deeper human response may be more difficult and more honest, to sit with uncertainty, to recognize that evidence can be incomplete, institutions can be cautious, memory can fracture, and yet wonder remains a valid form of attention, not a substitute for rigor, but a companion to it. Because what these artifacts truly reveal is not a hidden empire or a single forbidden chapter. They reveal the fragility of knowledge itself. Civilizations build archives and monuments because they know, even if only dimly, that forgetting is always near. Fire, war, erosion, pride, neglect, ridicule, fashion, politics, and time can all erase what once seemed permanent. The record we inherit is never the whole of what happened. It is only what made it through. And still, piece by piece, we keep searching. In caves and deserts, in riverbeds and shipwrecks, in the patient language of stone, metal, bone, and clay. We search because every object carries two histories, the world that made it and the world that later tried to explain it. Between those two histories lies the drama of being human. Perhaps that is the lasting lesson. Not that the past is stranger than we imagine, though often it is, but that humility may be the most important tool any explorer, scholar, or listener can carry. To approach the unknown without surrendering judgment, to protect curiosity from arrogance, to understand that mystery is not the enemy of truth, but sometimes its doorway. And somewhere, even now, beneath dust or water, or the ordinary ground beneath our feet, another object may be waiting, silent, unimpressive, easy to overlook, until the moment someone lifts it into the light and history, once again, is asked to remember more than it thought it could.